Hello, my name is Josh Brumberg. I am the Dean for the Sciences here at the Graduate Center. When thinking about the pandemic, we are all looking for silver linings. One such example is tonight's webinar, which was originally envisioned as an in-person event last March, but like so many things got put on hold. So I'm delighted to welcome a larger crowd online than we could have hosted in the Skylight Room at the Graduate Center for this important discussion about global climate change and if we have learned useful lessons as a result of the pandemic. Tonight is the fourth event in our Fall Change series. This extraordinary moment we are living in presents new opportunities for change across our society. In this series, we are exploring ways in which positive societal change can be made across multiple domains, from human interactions with each other and, as in tonight's case, with the environment. As a public university, the Graduate Center and its associated Advanced Science Research Center are committed to the idea that our scientific research has a role in advancing the public good. To help us understand how the pandemic has altered human behavior and in turn impacted our environment, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to our panelists. First, Dr. Stephanie Pincetl, who is the chair of the Department of Environmental Science and Engineering and the founding director of the California Center for Sustainable Communities at UCLA. Her interdisciplinary research focuses on environmental justice, bringing to the forefront the idea that strategies designed to mitigate the impact of human behavior on the environment have to be equitable. Next, we have Dr. Stephen Hammer, who serves as Advisor, Global Partnerships and Strategies to the World Banking Group's Vice President for Sustainable Development and the Global Director of their Climate Change team, and is their liaison to the United Nations, G7, and other developmental partners on issues surrounding climate change. Prior to joining the bank, he was a professor at MIT and Columbia. His research focused on how climate change will impact urban ecosystems. Finally, I'm glad to welcome in Dr. Patricia Romero-Lankao, who is a senior researcher at the National Renewable Energy Lab Center for Integrated Mobility Sciences in Colorado. Her research is focused on the interaction between people and the cities they inhabit, with a special interest in sustainability. To lead tonight's discussion, we have Dr. Bill Solecki, who is a professor in our Earth and Environmental Sciences PhD program here at the Graduate Center. And he is currently the acting chair of the Hunter College Department of Geography and the founding director of the CUNY Institute for Sustainable Cities. He has worked extensively to understand how climate change can impact the cities we live in. Before turning over the virtual microphone to Bill, a few words about how tonight's event will unfold. Bill will lead our three panelists in discussion. I'm sure many of you will have questions, which I invite you to submit via the Q&A function within the bottom strip of Zoom, and we will try our best to get to as many as we can during the latter part of the event. My job is done, and I'm going to join all of you in listening to Bill guide us through what I'm sure will be a fascinating discussion. Enjoy.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you for the panelists and the audience to come together to discuss this important question. I'm really deeply honored to sort of lead this discussion, plus the folks that we have before us really collectively represent some of the best minds and expertise and on the question of climate change and global sustainability. What we're going to be looking at is this question of what the COVID pandemic might mean for us with respect to addressing climate change. A simple matter, what a difference a year makes. Climate scientists, environmentalists were looking toward the 2020s as a period to institute a series of potentially transformative changes to sort of meet the conditions of the Paris Climate Agreement, to struggle with some of those sort of underlying questions of trying to achieve reduced amounts of warming below 2 degrees C toward the goal of 1.5 degrees C. We already recognize that the world's temperatures have increased about 1 degree Celsius above the baseline period of the late 19th century. And of course, we've seen many examples of increasing frequency of extreme events as illustration of a world increasingly in a condition of climate non-stationarity. and with that, an increasing set of demands to address these sorts of questions. The news and the science literature, and even at the community level, is full of these kinds of debates. The pandemic has sort of inserted itself in this sort of great tumult and sort of brought forward a whole set of questions. And of course, there's begun a dialogue with respect to how best to sort of understand what those impacts might be. How can the 2020 still be this sort of moment of transformative change with respect to climate action? Or is it sending us in a new and different direction? You know, what can we learn from the COVID experience and the pandemic, the inequities that it's revealed, as well as some of the opportunities for engaging new and potentially emancipatory and transformative technologies in and of itself. So these are sort of questions that kind of emerged in the early days of the pandemic, and we saw lots of, you know, kind of almost hopeful pictures, as we already heard, about silver linings, about skies that had previously been polluted cleared, the opening of streets for pedestrians, and many other sort of, you know, visible metrics of potential possibility of change. But of course, now 6-7 months on, we already have recognized the other side of this issue, besides the fact of tremendous health impacts, extensive and ever widening economic impacts, as well as sort of the revealing of a wide set of social and other environmental questions. So it's sort of a good time to take this reassessment and to bring forward these three experts to sort of address these kinds of questions. To structure the conversation, what we've done is organized this broadly around 6 questions. One is sort of looking at issues of consumption and how might the patterns of consumption that have been revealed and pushed forward in the current era, you know, what's valuable about them, and what can we move, how can we move forward with them. We're going to look at questions of the impacts of cities, and we recognize even in the city of New York the dramatic change that has come from COVID and our everyday experience, as well as questions as to occupancy in the city. We'll look at questions of inequity, and not only within country, within the United States, but also at the global scale, the implications that might have for climate action. We'll ask a question, looking at questions or issue of governance and how governance might be best adjusted to sort of fit a recovery period post-COVID. Also look at financing and the question of how to sort of bring forward resources to affect change that will be necessary as part of this recovery process. And then we'll sort of end off with this issue of are there other things that we should be looking at? So it'll be a dialogue. I will start the conversation around this question of consumption, and then I'll move forward and moderate through. And so as I ask the questions, different panelists will sort of bring forward their perspectives, and then we'll sort of move through the questions. And as was noted, around 8:15, we'll move to the Q&A and to bring forward other perspectives from you, the audience. So let me just start with this first issue of consumption. We've already recognized that the pandemic has brought forward tremendous changes in our everyday practice and how we live our lives. And the issue that I think is important is that what are the immediate implications for greenhouse gas reduction and climate mitigation, but how much of that, you know, what does that reveal about our opportunities for the future? What are some of these, how are these shifts going to be significant with respect to long-term recovery processes, and what might be some of these long-term legacies? So maybe we'll start with that issue, which is sort of a broader question, and then sort of circle back to some of these more specific things. So let me throw it open to the panelists in terms of consumption. You know, what do you think is going to be the long-term legacy of the pandemic with respect to energy consumption and the possibility of greenhouse gas reduction? So I'll open it up for any panelists to sort of start us off, and then we'll sort of move through the discussion that way. Stephanie has the biggest smile at the moment, so maybe she's got something in mind. Maybe I'll pick on you first, Stephanie, and then go on from there.
So it's been very interesting, right? So we have a kind of bifurcated set of reactions, right? On the one hand, people are rediscovering their neighborhood grocery stores and kind of reinforcing the local in that sense. And then you have Amazon making more money in the past 6 months than, you know, God. And so it's a very interesting kind of dichotomy, if you will, almost. And so for me, if we want to try to solidify or move forward an agenda that is has less impact on the climate, how do we reinforce the rediscovery of the local and foreshortening the kinds of supply chains, including reuse, going to the used clothing store instead of buying new. And some people have to do that, of course, because they don't have any money. But there's an opportunity there to reinforce this discovery of place. So I'll start with that.
Okay, excellent. Okay, Patty, yeah.
Yeah, I will follow with, and we got some data in our center on how COVID is in the short term, right, affecting consumption patterns. And I mean, to simplify things, you have sectors of the population that are even losing the ability to cover their basic food and shelter needs, etc. So, and then we have the sectors of the population, middle class to upper class people like us, who are rediscovering home. We are cooking at home, etc., etc. We have the luxury, so to speak, of working from home, and this is also affecting how we spend. For instance, the hotels, all this touristic industry is losing in this process because we are not traveling, we are not going to restaurants, etc., the way we used to be. So you have this other kind of middle to upper class sector that is changing their behavior in the meantime, right? And this is, given that we are the sector that mostly contribute to many of the problems the world face, because we consume more, we travel more, etc., etc. This is affecting. This is really already obvious in terms of the environmental impacts it has. But again, we don't know whether this will be short term or longer. This will have longer term implications. But I just really also want to say that the impact depends on the sector of the population you are talking about. And whether their job depends on industries and sectors that are being negatively affected by this virus, or as is the case with us, we are still, working from home, etc.
We'll go to Steve in a second, but you raised an interesting question, which maybe Steve will pick up. I mean, how do we sort of distinguish these early markers of change, right? So, like which of these changes might be sort of illustrations of things that might be useful in the context of climate mitigation? Are there any lessons learned that you're seeing coming out of this that might be useful for these larger debates?
I don't need to say that.
We'll go to Steve and then we'll come back to you, but I just wanted to pose that question to you generally. But that's, to me, a key point. Like, what can we already learn, right? We're 6-7 months in, what are those little glimmers of opportunity? Maybe to you, Steve.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks for inviting me to join the panel. Great question. I think, really picking up on what Patty was talking about, the way she was explaining, I tend to think of it as consumption of what? Consumption of goods, consumption of services, or consumption of experiences. So I was on a part of a panel this morning as part of the World Bank's annual meetings where it was a lot of small island states who were represented. And the tourism industry has just completely tanked in many of these countries. So the experience, the travel and the enjoyment of the islands, that has fundamentally changed, and many of them are not anticipating the full recovery for up to 2 years. Devastating impacts on their economy right now. So I think part of this question you have in terms of what do we know already, I think we know in the case, let's just take travel, whether it's on a subway or bus or on a plane, comfort levels are going to grow as our ability to influence that environment, whether through cleanliness standards or practices, through vaccines that may lessen the spread of any communicable disease. But also it may involve some fundamental change in terms of how crowded things are. we may end up, Carla Ratty from MIT wrote a blog for the bank recently talking about we need to change the timing of our cities. We need to move to different shifts, you know, and that would help lessen crowds on public transport and things like that. And then comfort levels may go up. So I think we have seen a lot, but the experience that we're finding at the bank is that it's very hard to speak with certainty because sometimes it seems as if it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, the pandemic reemerges. Sometimes it seems as if it's 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And so it's still very early day to know what the new normal looks like and how that's going to influence each of those things I was talking about, goods or services or experiences.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you brought up a lot of points in terms of this sort of issue of inequity, even the question of timing cities. You know, obviously there's going to be winners and losers in that space. And so, you know, sort of reconciling, you know, those kinds of questions is going to be, you know, key. Stephanie, I think you were sort of maybe wanting to respond to Steve in some way.
Yes, I feel that that kind of analysis misses the opportunity we have for transformation.
So could you be specific, like what, when you say that kind of analysis?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the island states now becoming dependent on tourism. What a tragedy that is, because that means that it is codependent with the emission of greenhouse gas emissions. It is codependent with importing lots of goods onto those islands, creating lots of trash that then has to be exported. The need for generating a lot of power on those islands. There's a lot of embedded carbon emissions in that economic dependency, which is another form of dependency for those island nations. So we're not posing the question about a pivot and a change, that we change our timing of when people go to work. We're not even thinking about, well, maybe that work isn't what we should be working on. Is it like the hedge funds, Wall Street? So I think that we need to go and ask a more fundamental question about the opportunities that this crisis brings and what it illustrates about the dependence on the burning of fossil fuels for all of these activities still, and the waste products that come from it and the rest. So I think that we should really consider much more deeply what the kinds of sustainable economies for even island states, or especially island states, might look like. I mean, the sea level is rising, so their future is a little foreshortened for tourism, right? Maybe 25 or 30 years for some islands. So what are we really talking about? My leisure, going there to give them jobs? I think it's a little hair-raising, actually.
Well, let me push that along a little bit, because one of the things that you started with, Stephanie, was this issue of place and rediscovering place. Now, if you look at cities, you know, and also in the context of sustainability, you know, one of the things that's happened in places like New York, I mean, you know, vast numbers of people, particularly wealthy, sort of moved out of the city, moved to the Hamptons, to various vacations, second homes and so forth. Or in some cases, you know, you see sustained relocation. You know, the exurbs around the city of New York are sort of, you know, experiencing a real estate boom. And so there's in some ways a redefinition of place, which is almost counter to what you've tried to. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you, but you presented this notion of rediscovery of place, but in the sense of consumption, individuals are acting in a way that is almost counter to that now, in many contexts. So how do we sort of kind of move through that sort of conundrum, in the sense that, you know, when we talk also about consumption, you know, the implicit notion is you're talking about individual behavior, but what you've also raised is a sort of more kind of systemic, kind of structural changes that we need to be thinking about. And that's also kind of part of the tension within the climate change community. There's a lot of focus increasingly on individual consumption. And in some cases, in some quarters, particularly in the kind of more established kind of ranks of this within, let's say, the Paris Agreement and the various sort of international agreements. It's focusing more on these individual or private company kind of responses rather than systemic changes. So anyway, there's a lot to take in there, but I think we have these sort of countervailing factors at work, and then in some cases the consumption patterns are sort of almost opposite to what we're seeing is opposite to what you're espousing. So I guess to push it along a little further, like how do we reconcile that? What are some of the mechanisms that you might see in the response to the COVID that might help us sort of reconcile those tendencies to sort of move toward ever more unsustainable worlds? I know it's a big swath of territory. I don't know, maybe Patty would want to tackle that one a little bit.
Well, I don't know whether I can, but I will give it a try. I think that, first of all, I'm always concerned when I see an emphasis on individual action and the consumer and the firm as an individual, because that leads us to forget that there are structural reasons why we behave the way we do. And, there are forces that emerge that explain behaviors and decisions, etc. And I also dream of changing the world, but the question is always, how do we do it given the initial conditions we have and the inertias we have, not only in infrastructures or the way we design cities, but also in institutions, in political polarization, such as the one the US is experiencing currently, right? So how can you engage in a conversation around change? And believe me, I'm asking the question to the group in these circumstances. So I'm always against focusing on individuals and just do your thing. I'm not indicating that that's not important, but that's a critique I have to many climate organizations, right? Oh, do they the right thing, separate trash, etc. Well, that's not enough. I think that we need to address structural factors moving us into one direction or the other. And that's one of the key challenges we are faced with.
Maybe to sort of, and I think you're right. I mean, these are, we've kind of tackled the big question of consumption. It gets into sort of very meaty territories. Maybe we can shift a little bit to some more specific domains. I'll let Steve respond to some of this, but let me also sort of move to some of these more particular issues. Like you mentioned, design of cities. Is there, we've seen this sort of, kind of a flowering of discussion about what COVID might mean. Stephanie, you've mentioned rediscovering place. There's a lot of discussion about opening streets and getting rid of cars and increasing bikeways and, lots of other things. And I guess the question, but simultaneously, we look at the skyline of Manhattan, we recognize that vast numbers of those floors of office buildings are empty, and that the corporations are basically telling, their employees, some can trickle back, but they might not be fully occupied for a long time. And it's sort of bringing into question the whole notion of the office space and the notion of what work is. So maybe we could look at this issue of the city, like, what might be the legacy of, the COVID pandemic with respect to the climate change questions in cities? Are there specific points that we might want to think about as we kind of move forward into this next part of this first year and into the second year of this pandemic? Maybe I'll put that to Steve, knowing his background on this question, and then we'll sort of circle through and then get to some of these other more specific items. So Steve.
Thanks. I mean, the one that immediately jumps to mind is, the whole issue of transportation. And how fundamental that is, and you talked about the open streets efforts. You have examples around the world of bike lanes being installed. Try and buy a bicycle. In the United States this past 4 months, it's been virtually impossible. It's just sold out. So people are willing to change to some extent as the weather begins to change. I think we'll see how or if appetites change for that. The thing that I think the longer term issue comes back to this, particularly in terms of long-term climate action, is where cities are going to get the money to pay for some of the infrastructure changes, to pay for some of the other institutional changes that they're going to need to pursue, to address a changing climate and changing conditions. We know that debt levels are increasing at both the national and the city level as a result of this. We're having a debate here in the United States about whether there are recovery packages that will fill that gap for cities and states. In other parts of the world, you're seeing the exact same dynamic. We had the rating agencies come and talk about the impact on cities in the developing world, and they have found something that I thought was actually an interesting dynamic. They found that greater budget stability was occurring in cities where there were it was primarily dependent upon fiscal transfers from central government down to the city. The cities that had more taxation powers, the cities that were able to impose fees for different types of services, they actually saw greater revenue drops and were struggling more because the cash transfers were still flowing, because those were the economic engines for the nation. And so the government was really focused on keeping that engine running. So one of the biggest challenges, whether it's in terms of real estate taxes or whether it's in terms of different types of taxes, may now become more prominent, and the need to go after the Amazon taxes as opposed to rely on sales tax by itself. There may need to be a rethinking of some of these revenue streams and how to ensure stability, because the bill is coming due. The cities are increasingly coming up with the plans of what they need to do, what they know they need to do because of sea level rise or drought or heat or what have you. And these are big ticket items. And so their ability to pay, they simultaneously have to be addressing the current challenges they have in terms of health and safety and income security with the long-term financial stability that will give them the wherewithal to make these big investments.
Yeah, you've really hit a very critical question, the financing. I don't know, maybe Stephanie and Patty could pick up on that point from their perspective in terms of, you created this notion of revenue streams and taxes and the like. Are there other sort of models that are out there, other ways of thinking about, bringing forward resources? Maybe Stephanie, I don't know, to pick that up.
Well, it just strikes me that we haven't addressed the question of carbon emissions. And, we have not priced carbon at a decent price, even in Europe, with the carbon markets. And so I just think that if we are not willing to be more bold in calling out the need to reduce carbon emissions and figuring out how to internalize those externalities, we're missing a revenue stream for sure, but we're also simply perpetuating a kind of running after the problem. So find that you buy your house in the Hamptons or the suburbs. What's your carbon tax? How much more is it going to cost you to heat that thing, because it's going to be enormous, than it did your apartment in Manhattan? And what are going to be your transportation costs when and if you choose to go into the city? And what kind of form of transportation are you taking? This is a huge opportunity for us to really figure out what it costs in terms of carbon emissions, because that's what is causing climate change. Sorry to remind us of that. And to address that. So airplane fares should be triple what they were. The only reason you get people flying around and like the way they are is because it's way too cheap. So and you get more revenue in that way, right? So we have to really be willing to step back and say, okay, we kind of lost our minds in the early 2000s, the late 90s, around all of these measures that are socially possible measures if we're willing to put it out there and work for it. But instead, we've been barraged by this idea that if you don't pay taxes, you have more economic prosperity, which frankly has never panned out. So we really need to move back to some kind of level of problem, solution, cause and effect, and think about those mechanisms.
Maybe I'll let Patty, and I want to introduce a related thought. Patty, did you want to pick up this conversation?
Yes, I really want to, because in my center, one of the key transitions we are examining is the electrification of transportation, right? And I think that history has taught us that if many countries have been able to subsidize private vehicles and to subsidize fossil fuels, etc., there are also opportunities to subsidize a pattern of electrification that really addresses a key challenge. And we have a couple of papers coming out showing this challenge. The challenge is that electrification of vehicles is focusing on the sectors that, no matter how you slice it, have the resources to buy any innovation in transportation and housing we are talking about now, in this moment, when we are talking about the energy transition. So what we are finding and suggesting in this work is that there are other electrification options, such as electrification of micromobility, electrification of transit, you know, and other countries are already involved in this, like China, like, you know, there is, I mean, the electrification of these modes of transportation is feasible technologically, and there needs to be also the political will to engage in providing the investments and the infrastructures that are needed to make this broader electrification that really serves the needs of people that even in the US tend to use transit and high capacity modes of transportation. So my point is, yeah, we need money, I agree, and we need to tax, right, what needs to be taxed, but we also need to not forget that political leaders, that policymaking are key in our efforts to transition away from our current system. And let me tell you, I mean, I think everyone has said that, but I want to say it again. For sure, COVID has thrown light in whatever is broken in our society, our safety nets, our inability to work with each other. But it also offers a huge opportunity, many opportunities. And one of those is in the transportation sector. One of the ones that is the highest, I mean, that depends so much on fossil fuels. Yeah. But there are other examples. So my point, the point being, yeah, we need money, but we need also policy interventions.
Yeah, let me actually turn to that point. Thank you for bringing it up, and also echoing a little bit Stephanie's and implied, and Steve, your point as well. You know, governance, right? You know, how do we, you know, there's a tremendous has been written about climate governance at various scales, and this need to sort of, you know, revolutionize or rethink governance to sort of attack this sort of, you know, monster sort of public policy question. And of course, people, you know, we bring forward this question, do we have the governance institutions? You know, and I think the COVID situation and the sort of the reflections that has brought has sort of, you know, kind of electrified those sorts of issues. Like, what are the governance? Like, even Stephanie, you mentioned like this sort of carbon tax of taxing someone who moves out to, you know, out to the Hamptons. How do we kind of organize that? I mean, is that something that's done at the state level? Like, obviously we're talking about national policy, but, you know, we'll also talk about a whole new approach to sort of governing ourselves. So maybe we could sort of turn to that. Are there particular kind of opportunities that you guys sort of see emerging from this time, you know, that maybe some of these early experiments with climate governance, like things that we now know might work really well, you know, from the lessons learned in the last 6 months, or maybe the last 6 months have revealed things that maybe imperil those sorts of ideas? I know, Stephanie, you've got the biggest smile again on this point, so maybe I'll come to you first, and then to Steve and to Patty.
I think I just have the biggest mouth. No, I'm enjoying the conversation. That's why I'm smiling. I think that the key is to understand how climate change is tied to all of the other social issues, and that we can't address it as a thing in itself, because that will not work. It hasn't worked. And so how the climate crisis is tied to the health crisis. The climate crisis is tied to the transportation crisis and the poverty crisis. These are integrated questions. And so if we can approach the question of segregated housing which the flight to the Hamptons or to those very incredible suburbs in New York represent. It's not just COVID, right? It's not just one thing. It's tied to this whole systemic set of issues. So we have to think much more carefully about how the things connect in order to be able to address the question of climate.
And do you feel that COVID has revealed those connections? I guess that's the point I want. At least to me, it's laid bare some of that, but maybe
Yes.
it hasn't fully revealed, right?
It's a work in progress. It has been since, before the civil rights movement, right? I mean, this is not, these issues are just brought to the surface better through COVID. They're not new.
Right, I guess, but the kind of the tenor of the evening and of time, of course, is that the 2020, how do we sort of, accelerate the process of climate action, in the context of all this other stuff, and specifically through governance? Maybe, right. Steve, I'll let you pick up on that, and then to Patty.
Yeah, let me jump in. So, I work at a financing institution, so I bring that lens to this question. And, come March, our attention moved from our long-standing development focus, very broadly focused, to a laser focus on rescue of economies, health system improvements, et cetera. As we've begun to, as the clients we work with, the governments we work with, as they've begun to get over that hump, and they're beginning to think about these questions that were mentioned earlier in terms of the structural transformations that might be possible. We've really begun to think about how the recovery, the economic recovery, and the stimulus money that's going to be made available. Some estimates are that $11 trillion in stimulus funding has been proposed to date. At the bank, globally, yeah. At the bank, we're anticipating upwards of $160 billion will move in 18 months. And, so how can, and that's public money. So how can that be used most effectively? And it does become ever more critical as you look beyond this money, and there may be a lesser amount of money available in years 2, 3, and 4, because debt limits will have been reached, right. Coffers will have been emptied. So this is the great opportunity now to capitalize on the recovery in a very strategic way. So one of the things that a colleague and I, Stefan Halligat, and I did was to develop what we called the sustainability checklist back in April. And it essentially was 37 different metrics, and it was trying to cover the full sustainability spectrum. It was about what kind of jobs, are they high paying jobs? Are they jobs going to high skilled workers? Or are they going to low skilled workers? Where are the jobs occurring? Look at where the COVID job losses have occurred. Are we putting the resources into those communities, or are we putting the resources where people still have been able to maintain employment? Are we looking at economic growth sectors, or are we looking at putting money into what we're calling zombie industries? The ones that are slowly dying. These are the fossil industries that may be slowly, turning into stranded assets in the next 10 or 15 years. So we really tried to put this on the table as a way to help engage governments, engage those who are involved in the financing discussions, to think very broadly, but to think systematically, so that as you look at the different stimulus options that you may be considering, you would begin to evaluate them on common criteria, apples to apples type comparison. And we found it's been an effective way to engage people.
Great. I'm going to go to Patty next on this issue of governance and sort of understanding some of the metrics. I want to weave one other thing into this, because I know you've also thought about this a lot, Patty. This issue of inequity. One of the things that is embedded in the question of governance and governance change is access to power and access to process. And also this issue of economic inequity, which part of the challenge I've heard from colleagues globally is, while we're debating in North America and Europe, the opportunities that COVID, or looking for those silver linings, other countries, and maybe Steve, you're more connected to this than myself, but like I've heard, anecdotally that they feel like they've been kicked back 2 decades in terms of their development trajectories and what they were hoping to achieve. So how do we simultaneously deal with this sort of governance question in a context of ever greater inequity? We see that within our country, the United States, but also globally. And before you respond, Patty, I want to mention to the audience that about 5 minutes or so, we're going to be going to Q&A. So please start putting your questions into the Q&A box. So to you, Patty.
Well, I mean, I'm humbled by the question in that it's clear to me, I'm from Mexico, and I'm seeing how while here in the US, we are discussing packages that, by the way, some of that money was allocated to support industries and sectors that didn't need anything, but that were good at lobbying, the government and getting their money. But that is showing you inequity in process, right? Who gets access to decide how monies are allocated is a key criterion of inequality, right? It's procedural injustices. But something I want to call attention to, to call your attention to is, I get the sense that COVID-19 might become another major blow to all the ideal of a globalized society or world that would be able to orchestrate action and to respond, in a coordinated way to the systemic challenges that we are creating. I think that we are confronted with a new emphasis in country-first politics and policies, and to new barriers to trade and investment. I don't know whether this will be a permanent trend, but I think that something is happening, and it started to happen before the pandemic. Am I saying with this that a globalized, orchestrated approach to solve our problems is not needed? By far, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that many sectors that are against globalization are not only the elites that are nationalistic or etc., but many people in Europe and in the US who became the losers in the globalized project that was sold to us in the 1980s, from the 1980s forward. So I just want to tell everyone that we need to think of, in these moments where globalization is being contested, where the idea of global supply chains, also got a hit, in this process, in this situation, it could be good to use another opportunity to rethink and to suggest ways of orchestrating that take the best of a globalized approach and also the best of the recognition of differences, of the inequalities, etc., of the importance of context. I'm just throwing that. It's not that I have an answer, but I think we need to be aware of this trend.
So I'm going to thread a couple of points that you guys have brought into my own mind, and then we'll go to the questions from the audience. But a recurring theme I've felt is this issue of localism, or like the local. And, Stephanie sort of introduced it in kind of the context of place and the sort of the pushback on globalization, or even the notion of vacation travel. I mean, like, why do we need to sort of get into a, aluminum tin box and then, go for hours? What's wrong with sort of visiting our places that are close by? Why do we need, So, I mean, it's a sense of localism. I mean, just to sort of thread through this, is that something that you see emerging as sort of or I guess let me qualify that. Is that something very specific to this moment in the depths of a pandemic where our view and our mindset is local? Is there lasting legacy in that? Maybe to you first, Patty, and then quickly to others, and then to the audience.
Well, I think that there are many trends underway, and what will end up happening will depend on what coalitions are created at multiple levels. But I think, localism, as in, buying locally, etc., has been part of the environmental discourse for decades. But what I see again are other forces at play, and I don't have, ways to see what will happen. But I think that many models of governance are being revisited as we speak. And for sure, Steve, you are in the World Bank. You can also tell us what you see. But in my collaboration, we do a lot of work in Latin America and Asia, also with the World Bank, and I'm seeing changes underway. I still don't know where we are going, but I think they are happening.
Could you give us like one example of a change, and then we'll go to the questions? I mean, like just something that we could sort of, you know, have in our minds.
Well, I hear over and over that this model of global supply chains has its limits,
Okay.
that we cannot depend on China to provide the world with whatever we need. And it's not nationalism, really, it's logistics. You know, it cannot be that something is broken because, I mean, China had its first problems, right, with with COVID. And there were moments where you didn't know where to buy many supplies. So I think that idea of the supply chain needs to be revisited, but I might be wrong. And it needs to be revisited because if we will be confronted with systemic risks and cascading effects, etc., I think we will need to rethink how to create sources of redundancy and flexibility, etc. But I want to hear what the others think about this.
Well, actually, I'll let them sort of incorporate their comments into kind of responses because we're running into the Q&A, so I apologize. But your point reminds me, of course, like the Bangkok about 10 years ago when Bangkok got flooded, and Bangkok was a major producer, I think, of hard drives or some other sort of a computer component, and the supply chain collapsed with respect to that. So that's an interesting point. So let's go to some of the questions. We've got some queuing up, and the audience went right to it. We have an election coming up. There's a possibility of political change in this country. With that, maybe the pushing forward of new agendas, particularly the Green New Deal. So what do we see coming out of the COVID experience that would sort of help, push that forward? Are there any sort of opportunities that have been revealed, lessons learned, things that we might want to think about in this context for the Green New Deal legislation? Maybe I'll put to Stephanie first and then back to Steve.
Well, I hope that's the case. But I think that we talked about a lot of kind of embedded structural pathways that we have. And so to change pathways away from business as usual is very, very difficult. So it's going to require not just the presidential change, but it's going to require Congress. It's going to require all of those states as well to have some political change in order to make it possible to do it, because there's so many pieces of it.
Okay. Steve, did you want to pick up any?
Yeah, I mean, spot on in terms of our experience that, one of the challenges, because in the COVID response approach paper that the bank developed to really guide and shape our engagement with our government counterparts, the notion of rebuilding better is fundamental. That's the third pillar. And so a lot of what we on the climate team and what my colleagues in other facets of the Sustainable Development Division at the bank have been thinking about, and even in the fiscal teams at the bank, how the instruments, how the policy discussions or the market reforms that we have great familiarity with and that we tend to be engaged with different countries on all the time, how that can all be brought together and become a part of these recovery discussions. So if a government is thinking about, we talked about carbon taxes, but we've also made a very brief mention of fossil fuel subsidies. Fossil fuel subsidies total hundreds of billions of dollars a year. Agriculture subsidies total hundreds of billions of dollars a year. You can make some changes in how those are done that can actually move towards a more climate friendly agenda. That needs to be married, however, to some of the market reforms, some of the regulatory reforms that will actually allow the alternatives to grow and thrive. So these are the kinds of things that we're talking about, how you sequence them, how you have to think about not just option A, but there are options B and C in terms of policy reforms that you may also need to be doing simultaneously. So as you're planning for the the resilience investment or the green infrastructure investment, you also need to be advancing new policies through government, as Stephanie just mentioned. One final thing, just the statistical tidbit. We just came out with our estimate yesterday that COVID will push an additional 90 to 115 million people back into poverty, extreme poverty this year alone, and upwards of a total of 150 million back into extreme poverty by next year.
Which was one of the key millennial development goals, to sort of end extreme poverty, which
Right.
was in some metrics achieved. Of course, that's all relative. And now that's sort of, much more back on the table. So another question kind of ties into this issue of the Green New Deal in a sense of the possible, right? That in the conversations, we've talked a lot about, one of the things that I think at least I reflected, and maybe you've also reflected, will the messaging this evening be optimistic or pessimistic? And I think it's really been both, and probably appropriately so. But one of the questions that came up from the audience is this issue of, like, in many cases, we sort of kind of know what to do. The solutions are sort of been written about, they've been established, but there's sort of, there's political intransigence or lack of capacity to act. How do we sort of move beyond that? And especially in the context of, clear evidence of remaining and even spreading inequities, even in the COVID response, but also certainly in climate, response as well, which oftentimes becomes an issue as presented as an issue of inequity. So how do we, this is a massive question, or at least the audience member sort of qualified it. They didn't necessarily assume an answer, at least maybe a comment. But how do we reconcile this sort of tension? And Steve, you kind of illustrated this a little bit in your comment, that there's a sort of, you have to involve a kind of a marrying of market reforms or economic reforms, coupled with policy. And of course, that's a very complicated two-headed, monster to move simultaneously. As you guys think about an answer to this question, are there examples where that has really played out successfully, where we've seen this sort of interplay of policy and engagement and economics that, maybe give us sort of hope? So there's a lot in there. I apologize. Maybe to you, Patty, first to sort of reflect on it. I know I want to make sure you come up first. But, how do we deal with this simultaneity of seemingly our inability to affect political change, specifically in this country, but in many other countries, but then also with the context of economic structure?
Well, I mean, I don't have the answer, but I think history can teach us some lessons. I know that the New Deal is an example, a historic example that many are talking about, and we're already talking about when talking about climate change, and the new Green Deal was discussed even in Latin America. By the way, someone from Ecuador started using this term. I think that there is a lot of coalition building that needs to happen. I would agree with Steve that we need to also have money, etc. But we know that when there is a good coalition behind some policies, there are lots of possibilities to implement, to design and to implement those policies. Something that I notice we need is to create an imaginary vision as a nation with some goals that really speak to the people on the ground, to everyone. I think that many countries, as we speak, have lost that. The leadership is losing this ability to speak to many. There is not this vision as to we want to go together, make sacrifices because there will be a good in front of us. And perhaps, I mean, some development of a narrative, a vision is something that we are missing as a nation in the US. And again, history teaches us that there have been visions of sorts before. And also in China, I did a lot of field work in China a couple of years ago. And I think that no matter how difficult the political situation there is, many kept telling me, yeah, but there is the promise of having a better life for my kids, etc. Something like that is we are lacking something like that in the US, in Mexico, in Latin America, in many countries, not in all. And so there are many ingredients that we need to work on. And again, I don't have the answer, but these are a couple of ideas I want to share with the group.
Excellent, excellent.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to Steve next, because I think from what I know of Stephanie's work, she'll be able to sort of tie some of these threads together. So Steve, any thoughts on this sort of tension between the politics and the economic forces? You kind of introduced the topic a little bit, so I'll come back to you. How do we move this sort of ball forward simultaneously?
Well, I think part of it's involved in who's engaged in these discussions. There's a new coalition of finance ministers for climate action that started a year and a half ago. They're meeting on Monday, their annual ministerial, and they're talking about green recovery. There have been a series of workshops that their technical teams have been participating this year. And the bank serves as the secretariat, and one of the things we really envisioned when we helped incubate this coalition was that it's the building of capacity, it's the growing conversancy of green economy, green recovery into the mindsets of hardcore economists, who were less familiar with these principles or these notions. So there is a comfort level that we're trying to facilitate through things like that coalition. The other thing we're doing is, so far, we've just reached agreement to put green recovery advisors, to embed them in the ministries of finance of 16 governments. And they will serve as focal points to help focus on project preparation, to focus on the rallying of resources from different financial institutions, to focus on some of the long-term governance and policy changes, in addition to the project development stuff that is what makes our money flow very quickly, into a very specific project in a specific place.
That's great. I'm going to turn to you, Stephanie. I just want to weave in one last question, which actually sort of circles back to our very beginning. And I want to thank, we'll soon be ending, and I want to thank the three panelists for be willing to be sort of mushed around by these questions and sort of, a little bit of a brain exercise. But one of the other questions, which actually circles right back, is this is very specific, but it sort of illustrates some of the difficulties. Retail space. I know it sounds like a kind of a little bit of a jump, but we see, you introduced at the very beginning Amazon and like how we buy things, and the stores of Manhattan are increasingly sort of, in some cases, while people are trickled back a little bit, there's really not the occupancy. What to do with all that retail space? How do we re-envision that? How does that reflect sort of patterns of consumption, or even in a variety of other contexts? So that is a kind of a little small nub of it, multiple sets of questions, in this sort of, byplay between politics and economics in the COVID recovery. I don't know if you want to pick that one thread up, Stephanie, because it leads back to consumption, but maybe
Sure.
you can give us some thoughts as we close out.
So I think that we have to remember that humans get habituated in their lives, right? That a lot of what we expect is normal is a habit. So the same with the way cities are laid out. So when I think of all that commercial space, I think housing, I think workshops, I think schools, I think public spaces, and it's an enormous opportunity to have much more public kind of space available for people to live in the city well. And one of the terms that I learned reading a really moving book by a Syrian architect was, we need to build welcoming cities. And we have not been building welcoming cities. We've been building exclusionary, money-oriented places that are the motors of economic development of the world. We need to build places where we want to live and be. And so that means just capturing that space back. It means thinking about the roads and the streets. It means how much energy do we need? It means you know, having the bench outside where you can just sit down and hang out. And that applies, I think, to many, many cities across the world today, where we have instrumentalized living together. And what the COVID shows us is that people are willing to go the length to help each other. That is the really extraordinary piece of this COVID catastrophe and pandemic, is people have come together. So we need to build on that capacity that we have.
I mean, that's an excellent way, I think, to end. Was it's an optimistic note. I mean, we've sing-songed back and forth between, you know, pessimism and optimism over the course of this past hour, and I think that's sort of part of what we've all been feeling in these past 7 months. And you know, we hope for better days. Let me sort of just wrap up a little bit to sort of thank the panelists. Again, you know, we tried to sort of get into, through dialogue, some of these early glimmers of what a future, you know, post-pandemic world might be. And I think, you know, for the audience and for all of us to think about, you know, as we emerge into that space, it'll be different from the time before, but also we recognize that we have agency. And I think all the speakers, the three panelists, sort of spoke about examples of agency. And so that's certainly a glimmer of hope as well. And then as we kind of move into this space, recognize that we have to become really, you know, have very precise lenses and sort of effective understandings of what's going on now, and how the decisions that are being made now are going to have these sort of add-on and additive effects as we move forward in the months and now years ahead. So I'm very much in the notion that these early conversations of a post-COVID world, and the actions that are being taken by the agencies, the institutions, by the financial organizations, by individuals, are going to have those sort of huge implications. So we as scholars and people who study these kinds of questions, I think those are the issues we need to be looking at. So I want to thank the CUNY Graduate Center for their engagement with this, and with the panelists as well. I don't know if the panelists have any sort of final thought to sort of add into this process. Again, I really, I'm very excited to have been able to sort of share these discussions with you. I'll just leave it open for a moment if anybody wants to sort of raise a final thought. Otherwise, thank you so much. You know, we are all part of a long journey, and let's get there safely and together and with effective change. So thank you. Take care.